Hello everyone, welcome back to the Swift Academy. Today we are continuing our series of creating the top trending movies application based on the MVVM design pattern for the iOS. This video is one of the most important part of this series because we are now going to talk about the observable or boxing methodology, that how we are going to passing data from the view model to our view controller, and also how we are going to create an observable or boxing class. So bear with me, this is so important. You can use it in the various methodologies, patterns, or even not only in the MVVM part. You can use it wherever you need something to observe it. Okay, when we are talking about the boxing or binding inside the MVVM pattern, what really it means? Up to now, you create the model, you create the view model, and also you all created the view controller inside our project. But when we are trying to passing the data from the view model to the view controller or updating the data inside the model, what will be happen? As I said, all the logics related to the getting the data from the server or getting some sort of the data from the database, or even changing, manipulating, or doing sort of the kinds to the data, all of them should be happen inside the view model. If there is something happen inside the view controller and it needs some sort of the processing related to the data, the view controller with kind of the events, for example delegation, or just directly calling the view model because it has the object inside the view controller, it has a reference to that, and the view model can do all the things for the view controller that presenting the view for us and getting back the data as soon as it's ready for the view controller through the binding. Also, for example, if something happening in the view controller that causes some change inside the model, it is the view model responsibility to change the model and then update it. And after the update, the model can notify the view model, and view model through the binding can notify the view controller, and the view will be changed accordingly. So to make it so simple for you, for example, when we are trying to populating the table view with the list of the data that coming from the server, it is the view model responsibility to get all the data from the server and then through the binding tell the view controller, hey, you have some data, you can present it. And then again, as you remember, inside the view model, the view controller asking the view model how many rows, how many sections, what is my data, and all of these logics happening inside the view model. Getting back the data to the view controller, as I said again, happening through the binding. So with this brief description about what is the relation between the model, view model, and the view controller here, let's jump to the code and discuss a little bit more about how we can define our own binding. There is a methodology called boxing that it is so useful. We are going to create our own observable class that we are going to use it everywhere that we need to observe a variable and see when it is changing, what we can do about it. So bear with me, let's jump to the code. Up to now, we find out how to getting data from the server and parse it, and also putting the get data method inside the main view model. The main view model has a reference inside our main view controller that can call it the get data method from the main view controller. But you know that when we are getting the data from the server, it may be a little bit timey for us because the response, the request, and all the parsing things behind the scenes. So we are talking about the binding mechanism. we are going to create our own observable class. So as soon as we getting the data, we are going to pass it to the main view controller and presenting the data. First of all, we are going to pass the whole data of the movies that we received from the server, and then later on I'm going to show you not only pass the whole data, you can pass the cell view models, an array or list of the cell view models, to the main view controller, so the main view controller can just simply pass each cell view model for each rows to present it. Now let's create our observable class, and then we are going to do the creating the view models for the cells and the UI and other stuffs. So inside the class groups or class folder, I'm going to create a new file and call it as the observable. I'm going to create a class called observable here, class observable, and this observable class should be generic type. What is the generic type? For the ones that doesn't know about the generic types, I really suggest you to go to the Apple documentation or to the website to find out what the generic type is. But it means that this class can contain every kind of the method. For example, a string, the variable types like integer, string, dictionaries, or even your own type. You can even pass your structure name, your own class to this generic type. So trying to find out what the generic is, and the reason that we are making the observable class generic is that we are going to use it in the various type of the variables. When we want to pass the integer or a string or a list or an array of one kind of the model, it doesn't matter for us. So we have to create our observable class as generic. So our observable class should have one variable, we call it as the value. So whenever the value change, it means that we have some data and we have to do something about it. This value should be generic as well. It means that it can be everything that we want. And also we can make it optional. It means that it can be nil. It means that we don't have anything to present, or the data that coming from the server was nil. Or when we are passing the data, we can even pass the nil data. So we can make it nil here. Also, we need an initializer here to initialize our value very easily. I make it an optional value here too, value t as kind of the generic, and then putting our self dot value equal to the value that coming from the initializer here. Now we are talking about the binding. When we bind something to something else, it means that whenever the value change, we should have something inside the closure. So we need a function called bind, and it has a sort of completion handler. We call it as a listener. It should be escaping because it may be the result coming from the server or another thread, and we want to pass it. So what it's going to pass, a generic type that is optional, is going to be passed as a kind of the completion for this method. So inside the closure, inside that function, whatever happened to the value, we have to pass it as a completion to this listener method. We need somehow find out when our value changed. So we are going to put a did set here, convert it to the computed property, and with this did set, whenever the value changed, we are going to be notified here. But when we are going to notify it here, we need also another listener that privately live inside the class to change all the things inside itself and then update the binding. So we need another private variable here, and I call it listener, and look at that, it should be the same as the escaping the completion handler that this function has, because it is a generic type, and whenever we are changing this method, this listener, or updating the value inside it, it's going to be notified our binding and change the data relatively. So it's going to be void, and also I'm going to make it optional because it can be nil as well. So let me see what I'm missing here. It should be private var. Okay, I just forgot to remove one parenthesis here. Now it's going to be good to go. And what happened inside the did set? Because it may be happening inside the various kind of the trees, I prefer to put it on the dispatch queue.main.async to all the change happening inside the main thread, because usually we are going to use the binding with the main thread, but this is up to you. You can actually don't use the dispatch queue.main here based on your use cases, but you can actually put it there and safely then use it wherever you want inside the UI. So what happened here? When something changed, it's going to call its own listener, and the listener is going to be update the value wherever it called, where it should be called inside the bind. So listener here is going to be update the value, and also the self listener that we have here in our own class should be the same as our listener because we recently updated it. This is all you have to do about observable variable. I know it may be a little bit confusing, but when you play with it a little bit and trying to put all the things together, you will be understand it. Believe me, at the beginning it may be a little bit confusing. Try to solve as much as problem or create something inside the playgrounds, for example 2 classes, and try to change something inside an observable variable and getting the data out of it. Then you will understand the whole logic of the observable. So now we have the observable class. We want to use it in our view model. Let's jump to our view model and see how we can use it. Now we are in our main view model. One of the use cases that we can use our boxing methodology or binding is that when we are getting the data from the server, it may be for example 2 or 3 seconds, or maybe less or more. It depends on your internet connection. How you are going to notify the view controller to show, for example, an activity indicator or a loader or some sort of the data or message to user. You can use the boxing when the data is going to start to load and when the data is finished loading, or something happening inside the main view model that the main view model is trying to getting data from the database, or processing some logics, or processing some image. So you have to passing some data to the view controller, so view controller can present it. We are going to using the boxing, that binding or observable that we just created as a type for our variable here. So I'm going to create, for example, isLoading variable. It is a type of the observable that we just create. If you see, if I'm navigating back to the definition of the observable type that we just created here, it's jumped back to our own class. So we have the observable, but remember, it is generic type. We can specify, okay, we need an observable, but what kind of type you need? It will be Boolean. Example, the initialize, if we want to initialize it, we can just simply, because our generic type is the optional, we can just initialize it with the nil. Or because we are using the isLoading here, we can just passing false, because by default nothing is loading, so we can just passing the false. And inside the get data, when we start getting the data, we can just check if is loading dot value. Remember, we have the value. If is loading data dot value is equal to true, it means that we are doing something. We shouldn't call the endpoint again. And because this is optional, we can using the double question mark to unwrap it safely and passing it safe data, and we are going to return it. So it means that something is loading. We are not going inside the get data to the color, and we are returning back the data from here. But when the data arrived, we have to do something about it. We have to show the view controller that we have the data. You have to remove your indicator. So here we are going to do the isLoading.value equal to the false. It will be automatically going to update the binding. But wait a minute. Because we are coming from another thread and this is inside the closure, we have to put the self here. But it may cause sometimes a return cycle happening here, because it may, this self inside another closure may cause some return cycles or self strong here. Because of that, before the result, we are going to put weak self, and this self that we have here is going to be optional. Now I'm going to add another variable here. I'm going to call it data source. Remember, inside the view model, I told you that we need our model, a reference to the main model inside the view model, that we are getting the data. Okay, we are getting the trending movie model here. I make it as optional, as the data source of the data that we are receiving here. So instead of just printing the data, I'm going to keep it to see if we have some sort of the data or not. Then we are going to put self dot data source. It's referring to our own data source. As you see, it's going to be optional because it's not the strong self. It will be going equaling to the data that receiving from the endpoint. And if you see the type, it will be a type of the trending movie model. It is the same type as the model that we actually define here as a data source. So we can safely put it here. Now with all that we have, and we have the observable, and we make it false and true, we just forgot about something. Just before we call the endpoint, we have to make the isLoading variable value true. It means that, okay, the loading process start and the loading process stop from here. Okay, all this happening inside the view model. Now we are going to bind this isLoading inside our main view controller to see how we can actually represent and act accordingly to the changing of this value. But first of all, let me add an activity indicator inside our view controller. So we are going to opening our zip files. I'm searching for the activity indicator. I'm going to put it on the top of our table view and make it as large white, for example, but the color is going to be system grade 2. And also I'm going to attach it at in the center of the view, and we have the IB outlets already here. I'm going to attach it to our view controller and name it activity indicator. So now we have the activity indicator. By default, I'm assuming that it should be animating and hide when stopped. So now we have that. Let's jump back to our main view controller. We already have the activity indicator. Inside the viewDidLoad, we have the config view, and we have a reference to our view model. But where is the binding? Okay, now we can actually create a function and call it bind ViewModel. And underneath of the function config view, I'm going to create that function bind ViewModel. Now if I want to bind is loading value there, when I type in the ViewModel reference, I have the is loading, and if I put another dot, you can see that I can access the value or I can access to the bind, and the bind is equal to our listener, and the listener returning back to us as a Boolean value. So I'm going to just hit the enter and hit the enter again, and just to make sure that we are not creating any retain cycle, I'm going to put weak self here again, and the value it is a Boolean value and it is optional. I'm going to call it is loading just like that, and inside that I'm going to put a guard let self equal to the self to make sure that we have a strong self here, and also let is loading. I'm going to create another one, is loading is equal to is loading. I mean it is not nil. In that case, if it is nil, I'm not going to do anything inside my view controller. So it may be cause some crashes, it may be some issues. Now I have access to the strong self here. I have access into the is loading that coming from the ViewModel, because I'm going to changing some data according to the activity indicator that presenting inside the main view, and the view is the main thread. I am going to use the dispatch queue.main.async, and if is loading, it means that the self.activity indicator should be a start animating, otherwise self.activity indicator should be a stop animating. So where I can actually call the get data, it depends on you. You can get data from the server inside the viewDidLoad, or you can get data inside other override methodology that actually we have in life cycle of the view controller. But I prefer to do it now for sake of this video to see what is happening here, just to put it as a didLoad here. So viewDidApear, and I'm trying to use the super.viewDidApear to load all the initial functions inside this didApear to be happen before whatever I want to do, and then going to call the ViewModel and get data. So let me give it a try to see if we are lucky to see the loader or not, because it may be happening so fast. Let me building the application again. So we are not so lucky because the data is coming up very fast and we get the data as soon as possible. But how I can see the loader here, I'm going back to the ViewModel, and when the data is come, I'm just trying to commit this line of the code and then again run the code to show you the activity indicator is still there. Yeah, as you can see, we have the activity indicator, but it's not a stop and hide because I'm not actually stop it here as soon as we getting the data. So now let's do something interesting now. Now we have the data source in our ViewModel, and we put it as the result of the data that coming from this endpoint. So now we have the number of rows somehow, yeah? So we can returning the self.data source. It has the results and it has the count. And also we can pass the data to the view controller. So because this is optional, we can just make it 0, because if there isn't anything, the row is gonna be 0 again. Also, we can pass the same data to our view controller. We have to pass the cellViewModels, but just in that case, to see how it's gonna work, let's create an observable value that representing our data and call it inside our main view controller to show you how we are going to pass even this kind of the data to the view model. So var cell data source, it's gonna be observable. It's gonna be a type of the list of the movies that we have it inside the trending movie here. You see that the results all is the list of the movie, and then I'm going to initialize it as the observable again. Oh, I didn't close it. Yeah, initialize it as the observable again, but as an empty list, or I can initialize it nil here. It doesn't matter. And then we can, whenever we changing the cell data source dot value, it's going to be bind inside our view controller. So for that reason, I'm going to create a function here, and I'm going to call it function map cell data self dot cell data source dot value, because we are updating it, equal to self dot data source, but we need the movies, the list of the movies. We're just going to add the results, and because it will be optional, I'm going to just pass a list of that. As soon as we changed it, it will be update the main view controller, but we don't have any listener inside the main view controller for the cell data source here. So here inside our bind view model, I'm going to add another binding here, ViewModel dot cell data source dot bind. We have a listener that, as you can see, it's returning back a list of the movies. So I'm just hitting the enter here. It is expecting the list of the movies. I'm just call it movies, and for the retain cycle, I'm just using this big self to avoid it. As you can see, we are now binding the data that coming from the view model here. As the top, we need to guard against the self here, guard self, let self equal to the self, and also let movies equal to the movies that coming from, else we are not going to do anything inside our view controller because it may cause crashes. Now we can actually update our own data source here. So what is our data source here? We can actually create some variables inside our class, variables, where data cell data source is gonna be a list of the movies that empty, and then we can simply update our cell data source with the movie that we just received here. And the next thing that we have to do, we have to update our table view, reload table view. So we need another function here, self dot reload table view, and we have to create it where inside all the things that should be happen the table view. Underneath of the register cells, I'm going to create the function reload table view, and always reload table view should be happen inside the main thread. So dispatch queue.main.async self.tableview.reload data. So to sum up, what happened up to now? We getting data from the view model, we map it to the cell data source that we just created, and we are going to change it in the next video when we are creating our cell UI. But we just passing the whole movie list through the binding to the main view controller, and then we are reloading our table view, and the table view after the reload is going to ask for the sections, the number of rows from the view model, and then populating the data here. Now instead of the index path.row, I can simply create the using the data that we are receiving in the cell data source here. So we have the self dot cell data source, then we can using the index path dot row and see what we have here. We have the title, name, original name, and other stuffs here. Let me choose the title here. Now let's build the app and see what's happening here. Oh, we have no data, and the reason is that we forgot to call the map cell data that we just created to update the value of the cell data source inside our view model to then bind it inside the view controller. So inside the API caller, after we assign the real data source, we can call our map cell data function to call it. And let's rebuild the app, and there you are, we have the data. But as you can see, we don't have all the name of the movies, because we let's come back to the table view, what we are using. Okay, we are using some of them as the name, but when we investigate a little bit inside the JSON data that server provided for us, some of them has the name and some of them has the title. So for getting the data or the name or the title, we can just simply here using another double question mark. If one of them is not ready there, we can actually use the .title one here. But if nothing actually there, we can use the empty string. Let me build the app and see if all the data again presented or not. Yeah, we have now all the data, all the 20 name of the movies, because some of them has the title and some of them has the name actually. But wait a second, is this logic? Yeah, this is the logic. Later on maybe it's going to be changed to the something else. Later on it's going to be changed to the original name or foreign name or whatever we call it. So we can simply move this logic to our view model. In the view model, I'm going to create a function and call it the get movie title function, get movie title. And what will be input of this function? It will be the movie item itself. And in return, we are going to passing back the string for the name as the name of the movie that we want. So we're just returning movie dot title if it is exists. If it is not, then returning the movie dot name. If it's that not exist, then return an empty string for us. So we have the get movie title inside the view model, come back to our table view, and because that's considered as a logic, I'm going to call it here to don't do any logical things inside the view controller. self.viewModel.getMovieTitle, and it asks me the movie. We can getting the data, let movie data equal to cell data source index path.row, and then passing this movie data to the get movie title via the view model. Let's rebuild the app again. Here you go. We put this logic get movie title and move it to the view model. So later on when we are trying to change anything related to the titles, we can achieve it here. That's all for this video. The next video, we are creating the cells for the each rows and creating the cell view model and describing how you can use the cell view model and passing the data to present it. See you in the next session.